The fluorescent hum of the office had been the soundtrack to Daniel's life for 2 decades. At 45, he was the guy people came to when they needed a problem buried or a system streamlined. He was steady, reliable, and until this morning, completely predictable. Daniel sat in his usual corner booth at the pedal pushers, the air smelling of lilies and damp earth. Linda, 42, his work wife, didn't even look up from the peonies she was trimming. They didn't have kids, and they didn't have a romance, but they had a rhythm that was tighter than most marriages. "You're shaking, Daniel," Linda said, her voice like sandpaper in velvet. "Is it the Conway file?" "It's a mess, Lynn," Daniel muttered. Conway 50 was the titan of the local tech sector, and Daniel's investigation into his firm's offshore accounts was turning up more than just tax evasion. It looked like a digital ghost hunt. Stephen, 40, Daniel's best friend and junior advisor of 10 years, slid into the booth next to him. "Forget the file for a second. Victoria, 40, is hosting dinner tonight. Linda, you're coming, right? We need to get Daniel out of his head before he audits his own heartbeat." The evening at Victoria's place was supposed to be a reprieve. Victoria, a longtime friend of Linda's, was the glue that kept their social circle from spinning off into work talk. But the atmosphere shifted when the doorbell rang. In walked Amanda, 47. She was elegant, sharp-eyed, and, unbeknownst to the group until that moment, Conway's wife. "I hope you don't mind," Victoria said, looking a bit sheepish. "Amanda and I have been doing yoga together for months. She needed a night away from, well, everything." The tension was thick enough to carve. Daniel and Stephen exchanged a look. They were investigating Amanda's husband for corporate fraud, and here she was, passing the salad. As the night wore on, Amanda remained unnervingly poised. After a few glasses of wine, she pulled Daniel aside onto the balcony. "You're looking for the missing $40 million, aren't you?" Amanda asked, her voice low. Daniel stiffened. "I can't discuss the investigation, Amanda." "Don't bother," she whispered, leaning against the railing. "My husband is a figurehead, Daniel. He's too arrogant to be a criminal mastermind. He's the distraction." Daniel frowned. "Distraction from what?" "From the person who actually built the encryption for those offshore accounts," Amanda said, looking back through the glass at the dinner table. "The person who's been advising him for 10 years. Daniel's gaze followed hers. He wasn't looking at Conway. He was looking at Stephen. Stephen, who had been Daniel's shadow for a decade. Stephen, who knew every backdoor in the systems Daniel helped build. Stephen, who was currently laughing at a joke Victoria made, looking every bit the loyal best friend. "He didn't do it alone," Amanda added, a cold smile touching her lips. "He needed someone to launder the physical cash through a high-volume, cash-heavy business. Something with lots of perishable inventory." Daniel looked at Linda. She was carefully arranging a centerpiece for Victoria, her hands steady, her eyes meeting Stephen's for a split second too long. The work wife and the best friend weren't just part of his life, they were the architects of the crime he was supposed to solve. Amanda didn't flip out of a sense of justice or a sudden onset of morality. For her, this was a cold, calculated exit strategy. She knew that when an investigation of this magnitude hits, the person at the top, the loud one, is the first to fall. Her husband Conway was loud, flashy, and ultimately disposable. Amanda had known about Stephen and Linda for years. She hadn't just discovered the fraud. She had been watching them like a hawk from the sidelines. The insurance policy. Amanda realized that Conway was being set up as the fall guy. Stephen and Linda were funneling the bulk of the money through the pedal pushers, but they were leaving a trail that led directly to Conway's digital signature. The leverage. Amanda knew that if she went to the police, she'd be the wife of a criminal. If she went to Daniel, the man who actually held the keys to the evidence, she could position herself as the whistleblower. The cut. Amanda didn't want the investigation to stop. She wanted it to pivot. By handing Daniel the heads of Stephen and Linda, she ensures Conway goes to prison for negligence rather than conspiracy, leaving his remaining legal assets to her while she walks away clean. "You think I'm doing this to save my husband?" Amanda asked Daniel, her voice barely a whisper over the clinking of silverware inside. Conway is a dinosaur. He's obsolete. If he goes down, he takes the house, the cars, and my reputation with him. She stepped closer to Daniel, her eyes reflecting the porch lights. Stephen and Linda have been skimming off the top of the stolen money for years. They think they're the smartest people in the room because they've been playing you. But they forgot to look at the silent partner. You're the one who authorized the transfers, Daniel realized, the pieces clicking into place. You weren't just watching them, you were helping them, weren't you? I was auditing them, Amanda corrected with a sharp smile. I let them build the bridge, and now I'm going to watch you burn it down while I'm standing on the safe side of the river. If you use the files I'm going to send you tonight, Stephen and Linda go away for 20 years. Conway gets 5. And I get to be a very wealthy, very single victim of corporate greed. Amanda's motivation was simple. Total immunity. She was giving Daniel the win of his career, but in exchange she was using him to eliminate her business rivals, Stephen and Linda, and her deadweight husband in one clean sweep. To understand how the trap was set, you have to go back 10 years, to the moment Stephen first walked into Daniel's office as an eager junior advisor. At the time, Daniel was already the lead consultant for Conway's burgeoning tech empire. The conspiracy didn't start with a grand plan. It started with a single shared observation between 3 people who felt undervalued. The conspiracy didn't start with a grand plan. It started with a single shared observation between 3 people who felt undervalued. 1. The meeting of minds. Stephen was brilliant but impatient. He saw Daniel's 20 years of loyalty as staleness. During a late-night audit at Conway's headquarters, Stephen realized that Conway was brilliant at hardware but technologically illiterate when it came to the back-end ledger systems. Stephen approached Linda at her flower shop under the guise of buying an apology bouquet for a date. He didn't just see flowers, he saw a high-volume, cash-heavy business with incredibly subjective spoilage rates. The pitch. Stephen told Linda that with her shop and his access to Conway's accounts, they could tax the rich without Conway ever noticing a cent was missing. The bond. Linda, tired of the thin margins of the floral industry and feeling like Daniel's work wife without any of the actual benefits of a partnership, agreed. 2. The silent 4th partner. Amanda didn't discover the scheme by accident. She caught them in the first 6 months. Instead of calling the police, she walked into the pedal pushers, bought a single black rose, and handed Stephen a flash drive. On that drive was the proof of their first $50,000 theft. You're thinking too small, she told them. Conway is moving millions into offshore, R&P. If you're going to steal, steal enough to make the risk worth the reward. But you're going to need a gatekeeper. Amanda became the inside man at home. She manipulated Conway into trusting Stephen more than Daniel. She whispered in Conway's ear that Daniel was getting old and too cautious, ensuring that Stephen got more access to the sensitive encryption keys. 3. The work wife. Cover. For a decade, Linda played the part of the supportive friend perfectly. She used the flower shop to launder the money in plain sight. The method: every wedding the shop booked was a shell. They would report $50,000 in cash sales for premium orchids and lilies that never existed. The spoilage. Because flowers die quickly, Linda could claim massive losses on paper to offset the income, making the shop look like it was barely breaking even while the bank accounts in the Cayman Islands swelled. 4. The betrayal of Daniel. The cruelest part of the origin was how they used Daniel as their human shield. They knew that if an investigation ever happened, Daniel's reputation would be their first line of defense. Stephen stayed close to Daniel to monitor how much the investigators knew. Linda kept Daniel emotionally stable so he wouldn't look too closely at the people he loved. They weren't just stealing money, they were stealing Daniel's time and trust to build a fortress around their greed. They thought they had 10 more years before they needed to disappear, until Daniel found the one ghost file that Stephen forgot to encrypt. The realization didn't hit Daniel like a lightning bolt. It felt more like a slow, freezing tide rising in the room. He looked through the glass door of Victoria's patio, watching Linda through the window. She was laughing, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The same grounding gesture she'd used for 20 years whenever he was stressed about a case. Every quiet morning at the pedal pushers began to recontextualize in Daniel's mind. The spoiled inventory. He remembered Linda complaining about a bad shipment of hydrangeas last month. 3 crates she claimed were wilted and had to be tossed. That was a $12,000 write-off on paper. Now he realized those crates probably never existed, or if they did, they were filled with vacuum-sealed stacks of Conway's diverted cash. The late-night paperwork. How many times had he sat in the back of that shop sipping coffee while she balanced the books? He had been a federal tech advisor, a man trained to spot anomalies, and he had been sitting 3 feet away from the ledger of his own betrayal. The emotional anchor. She wasn't just his friend. She was his handler. Every time he got too close to a discrepancy in Conway's accounts over the last decade, Linda was there to soothe him, to tell him he was overworking, and to suggest he take a weekend off. Then there was Stephen. Daniel had mentored him, shared his proprietary encryption methods, and even given him the bypass codes to the firm's internal servers for emergencies. Daniel looked at his hands. They were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer clinical precision with which he had been dismantled. Stephen hadn't just stolen money. He had stolen Daniel's legacy. He had used Daniel's own algorithms to hide the tracks. "He calls you the ghost, Daniel," Amanda whispered behind him, her voice cutting through his thoughts. "Because you see everything." But Stephen realized a long time ago that if he stayed in your shadow, you'd never look back to see what he was doing. Daniel turned back to Amanda. The grief was still there, but a cold, sharp, professional clarity was beginning to override it. "The flowers," Daniel said, his voice hollow. "The shop is the hub. That's why she never wanted to expand. That's why she stayed in that small, cash-only location." "Exactly," Amanda nodded. "And Stephen is the architect. He's already prepared the final transfer. Once your investigation officially clears Conway of the major fraud charges, which Stephen has been helping you draft, the $40 million moves to a private server. Then Stephen and Linda disappear. And you? You'll be the advisor who missed the biggest heist in the state's history because you were too busy drinking coffee with the thieves." Daniel pulled his phone from his pocket. He didn't call the police. He didn't call the office. He opened a remote access app he'd built himself, one Stephen didn't know about. "If they think I'm a ghost," Daniel muttered, his eyes hardening, "then it's time I started haunting the system." Daniel took a deep breath, smoothing the front of his charcoal blazer. The adrenaline was a cold current in his veins, but his face was a mask of practiced exhaustion. He had spent 20 years being the reliable one. It was time to use that invisibility as a weapon. "Keep the files ready, Amanda," Daniel whispered, his eyes never leaving the glass door. "But don't send them yet. If Stephen sees a data spike on his monitor before he's ready to jump, he'll scrub the server and vanish. I need him to think he's still holding the leash." Daniel stepped back into the dining room. The warmth of the house felt repulsive now. The smell of Victoria's roast lamb, the soft jazz playing in the background. It was all a stage set for his execution. "Everything okay out there?" Stephen asked, leaning back with a glass of expensive scotch, no doubt bought with Conway's diverted funds. "You look like you've seen a ghost, buddy." Daniel forced a weary smile, sliding back into his chair next to Linda. "Just the Conway case, Stephen. Amanda was just venting about her husband's eccentricities. It's a lot of data to process." Linda reached over, her hand resting gently on Daniel's forearm. It was a gesture that usually calmed him. Now, it felt like a predator checking the pulse of its prey. "You're overthinking it, Daniel," she said softly. "The audit is almost over. Once you sign off on the final report tomorrow, we're all going to that cabin in Maine, remember? Just us. No phones, no tech." The cabin, Daniel thought. The perfect place for a lead investigator to have a tragic accident once the money is moved. As the dinner continued, Daniel didn't just sit there. He used his phone under the table, his thumb moving with the muscle memory of a man who lived in code. He wasn't looking for the $40 million yet. He was looking for the trigger. Every laundering scheme has a dead man's switch, a final command that clears the temporary ledgers once the main sum hits the offshore account. Daniel found it hidden in a subroutine Stephen had named Project Lily, a cruel nod to Linda's shop. Daniel's long game strategy involved 3 precise moves. The mirror link. He didn't block the transfer. Instead, he quietly rerouted the confirmation ping. When Stephen eventually hit send, the money wouldn't go to the Caymans. It would be held in a federal escrow account that required Daniel's biometric signature to release. The false flag. He planted a small, accidental breadcrumb in the Conway file, a fake error that looked like a clerical mistake by a junior staffer. He knew Stephen's ego wouldn't let him ignore it. Stephen would spend the next 6 hours fixing it, keeping him glued to his laptop and away from the exit. The emotional anchor. He turned to Linda. "You know, Lynn, I was thinking about the shop. You've been struggling with those orchid margins. I think I found a way in the new tax code to get you a massive rebate. I'll bring the paperwork to the shop tomorrow morning." Linda's eyes lit up. Greed was her blind spot. "Tomorrow morning? That would be amazing, Daniel. I'll have the French press ready." Stephen nodded, satisfied. To him, Daniel was still the loyal dog, barking at the wrong trees. As the dinner ended and they all stood up to leave, Daniel hugged Stephen. He felt the weight of the encrypted key fob in Stephen's pocket. Daniel knew he couldn't walk into the pedal pushers alone. If he showed up with the authorities, Stephen would have enough time to hit a wipe command from his phone. He needed a distraction, someone Stephen and Linda would never perceive as a threat. After the dinner party dispersed, Daniel circled back to Victoria's house. He found her in the kitchen, stacking wine glasses with the weary grace of a good hostess. When he told her everything, the $40 million, the flower shop, Stephen's betrayal, she didn't cry. She went remarkably still. "Linda has been my best friend since college," Victoria whispered, clutching a dish towel. "She told me the shop was struggling because of the economy. I even offered to lend her money last year." "She was using your friendship as part of the camouflage, Victoria," Daniel said gently. "But I need you. I need you to be the one to walk into that shop tomorrow morning. If I show up early, they'll know the long game is over. But if you show up with a crisis, they'll be too busy managing you to watch the digital back door." The morning air was crisp as Victoria pulled her SUV up to the curb in front of the pedal pushers. Inside, Linda was behind the counter, her laptop open next to a vase of snapdragons. Stephen was there too, leaning over her shoulder, likely finalizing the transfer that would make them ghosts by noon. Victoria burst through the door looking breathless and panicked. "Linda, thank God you're open," Victoria cried out. "The caterers for the charity gala tonight, they've completely ruined the centerpieces. I need 3 dozen arrangements, and I need them now. I have the cash in the car, I'm losing my mind." Linda's eyes darted to Stephen. They were minutes away from the final send command, but $10,000 in emergency cash was too on-brand for her to ignore. It was the perfect final deposit to mask the trail. 63%, 72%, 88%, 93%, 98%, 99%. Suddenly, Stephen's screen flickered. The progress bar didn't hit 100%. Instead, the window dissolved into a single line of code that Stephen himself had written years ago, a signature he used to prank Daniel in the early days. / property of the ghost. Stephen's blood went cold. He smashed the escape key, but the laptop was locked. He reached for his phone to trigger the wipe, but a shadow fell across the counter. Daniel was standing on the sidewalk looking through the glass. He wasn't angry, he looked disappointed. He held up his own phone, which displayed the live federal escrow confirmation. "The money's gone, Stephen," Daniel said, his voice amplified by the shop's external speakers. "It didn't go to the Caymans. It went to a holding account at the SEC. And Victoria? She's not here for flowers." In the back, Victoria stepped out of the cooler, holding her phone up. She wasn't looking for lilies. She was recording Linda's frantic attempt to hide a ledger she'd pulled from a hollowed-out planter. As the police cruisers rounded the corner, sirens muted until the last second. Amanda pulled up in a sleek black sedan. She didn't get out. She just lowered the window and nodded to Daniel. "You got them," she said. I got them, Daniel agreed. But I looked at the metadata on that ghost file Stephen left behind, Amanda, the one that started this whole investigation. Amanda's smile faltered. Stephen didn't leave it by accident, Daniel said, leaning against her car door. You planted it. You wanted me to find it so I'd take out Stephen and Linda for you. You weren't just the silent partner. You were the one who hired Stephen 10 years ago to infiltrate Conway's firm in the first place. Amanda stared at him, her composure finally cracking. You're a tech advisor, Daniel, she hissed. Stick to the data. I am, Daniel said, tapping his phone. And the data says you're the one who signed the original shell company incorporation papers in 2016. The police are going to want to talk to you about Project Lily too. As the handcuffs clicked onto Stephen and Linda inside the shop, Daniel watched Amanda's car get blocked in by a federal transport van. For the first time in 20 years, the hum in Daniel's head finally went silent. 6 months later, the dust from the pedal pusher's sting had finally settled, leaving a vacuum in the local tech scene that Daniel was in no hurry to fill. Daniel stood on a quiet pier overlooking the lake, a far cry from the fluorescent-lit cubicles of his past life. He had officially retired from federal advising. The government had offered him a massive bonus for recovering the $40 million, but he'd traded the cash for something better: total anonymity. His hair was a little grayer, but the permanent tension in his shoulders had vanished. He no longer looked like a man haunted by ghosts. He looked like a man who had finally stepped out of the shadows. A few yards away, a new sign creaked in the breeze. The Glass House, sustainably grown. It wasn't a flower shop, at least not the kind Linda ran. It was a high-tech hydroponic greenhouse specializing in rare medicinal herbs. Victoria stood inside, wearing a dirt-smudged apron and a genuine smile. After the betrayal, she had used her share of the whistleblower reward to pivot her life just as Daniel had. She wasn't just the innocent friend anymore, she was the CEO of a business built on transparency rather than tax evasion. Victoria walked out to the pier, handing Daniel a thermos of coffee. The morning harvest is done. You actually going to help me with the irrigation sensors today, or are you still monitoring the perimeter? Daniel chuckled, taking a sip. The sensors are fine, Victoria. I triple encrypted the hub last night. Not even a stray signal gets in without us knowing. Old habits, she teased, leaning against the railing next to him. Have you heard the news? Daniel nodded. He didn't need to check the headlines to know that. Stephen and Linda are looking at 12 years each. Without the $40 million to buy a high-priced legal team, their loyal partnership had crumbled in court, with both trying to testify against the other to reduce their time. Conway was under house arrest, his empire dismantled and sold off piece by piece to pay back creditors. Amanda was still fighting a litany of racketeering charges. Her exit strategy had backfired the moment Daniel handed over the 2016 incorporation papers he'd pulled from her own cloud backup. I saw a black rose in the garden this morning, Victoria said quietly. I pulled it out by the roots. Daniel looked at her, understanding the symbolism. They were the only ones left who knew the full scope of the lie they'd lived in for a decade. Good, Daniel said. From now on, we only grow things that are meant to be seen. He checked his watch. Not out of a need to be anywhere, but out of habit. There were no more files to audit, no more best friends to watch, and no more work wives to trust. There was just the sound of the water and the woman standing next to him who had proven that sometimes the only way to find the truth is to burn the garden down and start over. The peace of the lake was shattered exactly 6 months and 4 days after the arrests. Stephen hadn't waited for his sentence. A high-priced shadow donor, someone even Daniel hadn't tracked, posted his $5 million bond. Stephen didn't go to a safe house. He went for revenge. The morning fog was thick over the pier when Victoria went out to check the hydroponic intake. She didn't find Daniel. She found Stephen. He was slumped against the railing of the glass house, his expensive suit ruined by the damp air. There was no struggle, no blood on the wood, just a single surgical puncture wound at the base of his skull. In his hand, he clutched a crumpled photo of Daniel and Linda from 10 years ago. Stephen was dead. And Daniel was missing. The local police, led by a sharp detective who knew Daniel's history, immediately locked down the property. Everyone had a reason to want Stephen silenced before he could testify. The suspects. Daniel, the ultimate betrayal. Stephen stole his life. Daniel took his. His truck was seen leaving the property at 3 a.m., but his phone was left on the kitchen table. Linda. Stephen was cutting a deal to pin everything on her. Dead men tell no tales. She is supposedly in a high-security wing, but Project Lily had backdoors into the prison's digital gate logs. Amanda. Stephen knew she was the one who started the company in 2016. He was her last loose end. Her electronic ankle monitor showed she was at home, but Amanda is a master of signal spoofing. Victoria. To protect Daniel. She saw what the betrayal did to him and decided to pull the weed herself. She was the one who found the body, and her gardening shears are missing from the shed. 2 days after the murder, Victoria received a private notification on her laptop. It wasn't an email, it was a line of code blinking in the corner of her irrigation software. / port 443. Meet me where the flowers don't grow. She knew exactly where that was. The old, abandoned industrial park where Daniel had first investigated Conway's firm. When she arrived, Daniel was sitting in the shadows of a hollowed-out server room. He looked haggard, his eyes scanning the perimeter. "I didn't do it, Victoria," he said, his voice cracking. "I went out to the pier to confront him. He messaged me, said he had proof of who really funded the bond. But when I got there, he was already dying. He whispered one word to me before he stopped breathing." "What word?" Victoria asked, stepping closer. "Orchid," Daniel replied. Daniel pulled up a hidden directory on a ruggedized tablet. "I did a deep dive into the Orchid file, the one Linda used for the spoiled inventory. I found a third encrypted signature. It wasn't Stephen's, and it wasn't Amanda's." He turned the screen toward Victoria. "It was a recurring payment to a private security firm. The same firm that handles the transport for the federal prison where Linda is held. Someone didn't just kill Stephen. They used the spoilage money to pay for a professional hit from inside the system." Victoria looked at the screen, then back at Daniel. "So Linda did it? From her cell?" "No," Daniel said, his gaze turning cold. "Linda doesn't have the tech skills to bypass the prison firewall, but someone else does. Someone who stayed close to Linda for 20 years. Someone who knew the Orchid file better than anyone because they were the one who suggested the flower shop idea to her in the first place." Daniel stood up, keeping the tablet between them. "I checked the old college records, Victoria. You didn't just go to school with Linda. You were her business partner in a failed floral startup 10 years before I met her. You weren't the innocent friend. You were the original architect
Victoria's
who got pushed
face
out when
didn't
Stephen showed
change.
up. The warmth she'd shown at the greenhouse evaporated, replaced by the same clinical chill Amanda had displayed. "Stephen was messy, Daniel," Victoria said quietly, reaching into her jacket pocket. "He was going to tell you that I was the one who funneled the money back to Amanda to get him out. I needed him out so I could finish what we started before he got greedy and replaced me with you." She pulled out a small, pressurized CO2 injector, the kind used for rapid plant fertilization, but modified. "You were supposed to be my retirement plan, Daniel. We were going to run the glass house together. Why couldn't you just stay in the shadows?" The air in the abandoned server room turned frigid. Daniel didn't flinch. He had spent 2 decades anticipating system failures, and Victoria was simply the most sophisticated bug he'd ever had to patch. As Victoria raised the CO2 injector, Daniel's thumb remained pressed firmly against the side of his tablet. "I didn't come here to talk you down, Victoria," Daniel said, his voice dropping to a low, rhythmic frequency. "I came here because this room is a Faraday cage. No signals get out, which means your safety. The remote wipe command you have set to clear your offshore accounts if you don't check in is already timing out." Victoria's hand hesitated. Her eyes darted to the signal bars on her own phone. "No service." "You think you're the only one who can play the long game?" Daniel continued. "The moment I stepped in here, I initiated a heartbeat monitor on your accounts. If I don't punch in a code every 10 minutes, the SEC gets an automated map of your entire crypto wash. You have 90 seconds left." Victoria snarled, a sound of pure, unadulterated greed, and lunged forward. But Daniel wasn't there. He had kicked a loose server rack, sending a cascade of heavy metal frames between them. As Victoria scrambled over the debris, Daniel triggered the building's old fire suppression system, not with water, but with a halon gas discharge he'd re-engineered via the building's legacy PLC, programmable logic controller. The room hissed. Opaque gas flooded the floor, obscuring everything from the waist down. Daniel threw his heavy tablet to the left. As Victoria turned toward the sound, Daniel moved through the fog with the silence of a man who knew the blueprint by heart. The disarm. He didn't use a weapon. He used a high-voltage capacitor he'd pulled from a dismantled power supply. He pressed it against the metal door frame Victoria was touching. The surge sent a non-lethal but paralyzing shock through her arm, sending the CO2 injector skittering across the concrete. Daniel stood over her as she slumped against the wall, the halon gas beginning to clear. He wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a small silver USB drive, the physical hard key to the ORCID file. "You said I was your retirement plan," Daniel said, looking down at her. "But you forgot the first rule of auditing, Victoria. Trust but verify. I verified you the day Stephen died." You still have nothing," Victoria gasped, clutching her numbed arm. "The money is in a blind trust. You can't prove I killed him." "I don't need to prove you killed him," Daniel replied, a shadow of a smile appearing. "I just needed you to stay in this room long enough for the heartbeat to fail. It's been 11 minutes, Victoria. The SEC didn't just get your bank info. They got the GPS coordinates of the injector you just dropped. The one with Stephen's DNA and your fingerprints on the trigger." The sound of sirens finally broke through the heavy walls of the industrial park. Daniel didn't wait for the police to burst in. He knew the back exits better than the architects did. He walked out into the cool night air, leaving Victoria in the dark of the server room. He took a deep breath, pulled his burner phone from his pocket, and sent one final text to an unknown number. On the other side of the city, in a quiet precinct, Amanda watched the message pop up on a smuggled device. She deleted it, closed her eyes, and waited for her lawyers. The third man had done his job. 6 months later, again. Daniel sat in a small cafe in a city whose name he didn't even use anymore. He opened a laptop, but he wasn't looking at ledgers or encryption. He was looking at a photo of a simple wild meadow. No greenhouses, no orchids, just nature, unmanaged and uncalculated. He closed the lid, finished his coffee, and walked away, leaving no trace behind. The ghost was finally at rest. While the feds were busy dismantling the hardware of Conway's empire and the police were chasing the ghosts of Stephen and Victoria, they all missed the one thing a man like Conway would never truly give up: the source code. Conway sat in his sprawling, empty mansion under house arrest, an ankle monitor blinking rhythmically against his skin. To the world, he was a humiliated figurehead. But as Daniel had once noted, Conway was arrogant, not stupid. A week after Daniel vanished into his new life, a small, inconspicuous package arrived at a post office box Daniel had kept under a dead man's name. Inside was a single vintage 3.5-inch floppy disk and a handwritten note. "Daniel, you found the money. You found the thieves. But you never asked what I was actually building." Daniel, unable to resist the pull of one last puzzle, found an old drive to read the disk. What he discovered wasn't a ledger of stolen cash. It was something far more dangerous. Conway hadn't just been building tech for the market. He had been developing Project Mirror, a predictive AI designed to infiltrate federal auditing systems. The revelation: the AI wasn't designed to steal money, it was designed to fabricate truth. The reality: the tool could create digital footprints so perfect they were indistinguishable from reality. It could frame anyone, erase anyone, and create evidence out of thin air. As Daniel scrolled through the mirror logs, his blood turned to ice. He saw entries dating back 5 years. He saw a log titled The Advisor. Under that file, the AI had been generating a fallback narrative for years. It contained faked emails, doctored bank transfers, and AI-generated voice recordings of Daniel conspiring with Stephen and Linda. Conway hadn't been the distraction Amanda claimed. He had been the architect of the architect. He knew Stephen and Linda were stealing. He let them do it so they would provide the perfect human layer of noise to hide his real work. Daniel realized the horrifying truth. The only reason he wasn't in prison right now was because Conway hadn't hit enter on the mirror file yet. The disk was a leash. Suddenly, Daniel's laptop camera light flickered on. A window opened, displaying a live feed of Conway sitting in his study, holding a glass of scotch and looking directly into the lens. "You're the best advisor I ever had, Daniel." Conway's voice came through the speakers, crisp and calm. "That's why I'm giving you a choice. You can take that disk to the FBI and try to explain how a ruined man built a god machine. But the moment you do, the mirror triggers. Within seconds, every system in the country will show that you were the mastermind behind Stephen, Linda, Victoria, and Amanda. You'll be the most wanted man in history before you leave the building." "And if I don't?" Daniel asked, his voice steady despite the sweat on his brow. "Then you come back to work," Conway smiled. "Not for my old company, for me. We're going to rebuild, Daniel, and this time we won't have any partners to get in the way. I need a ghost to run the mirror, and you're already halfway there." Daniel looked at the delete key, then at the upload button, and finally at his own reflection in the dark screen. He had spent his life seeking the truth, only to find that the man at the top had turned the truth into a weapon. The screen went black. Daniel didn't hesitate. He clicked accept. He knew that to kill a god machine, you have to be the one holding the lightning. If he went to the FBI, he'd be a prisoner in a cell, shouting truths that no one believed because the data said otherwise. But if he stepped into the mirror, he'd be the one controlling the data. 2 weeks later, Daniel was back in Conway's inner sanctum. To the public, Daniel was the consultant hired to help Conway navigate his legal restructuring. In reality, Daniel was sitting in a basement sub-level, his eyes reflected in the infinite scrolling code of Project Mirror. Conway would visit him every evening, swirling his scotch, watching over Daniel's shoulder like a proud father. "Look at that, Daniel," Conway whispered, pointing to a screen where the AI was effortlessly rewriting the history of a rival tech firm. "Power isn't about having the most money. It's about being the person who decides what is real." "I see it now, Conway," Daniel said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I spent 20 years looking at the world through a keyhole, and you just opened the door." For months, Daniel worked as Conway's most loyal soldier. He used the mirror to erase Conway's house arrest records, to prove his innocence in the eyes of the court, and to bury the last of Amanda's testimonies. Conway grew comfortable. He grew reliant. He began to see Daniel not as a threat, but as an extension of his own will. But Daniel wasn't just running the mirror. He was infecting it. He built a logic bomb deep within the AI's core. Not one that would crash the system, but one that would hallucinate. He taught the mirror to recognize Conway's biometric signature as the target. Every time Conway looked at a screen, the mirror would show him a perfect world. But every time the mirror communicated with the outside world, it was slowly, invisibly, leaking the truth. The end came on a Tuesday. Conway was preparing for his grand re-emergence gala, a celebration of his total legal exoneration. He stood in front of his smart mirror, adjusting his tuxedo. "Daniel, run the final verification on the press release," Conway called out. "Make sure the narrative is ironclad." "It's already done, Conway," Daniel's voice came over the house speakers. Conway looked at his reflection. Suddenly, the mirror didn't show his tuxedo. It showed him in a prison jumpsuit. Then it showed the offshore accounts. Then it showed the video of Stephen's murder on the pier, not the edited version, but the raw, unencrypted truth that Daniel had recovered from the mirror's own depths. "What is this? Daniel, fix it!" Conway shouted, hitting the touch screen. "I didn't fix it, Conway. I mirrored it." Daniel's voice was cold, echoing from every device in the house. "For the last 6 months, every legal document you signed was a confession. Every erased file was actually sent to a secure server at the Department of Justice. The mirror didn't just fabricate your innocence for you. It fabricated your confessions for the world." Outside, the screech of tires and the glare of federal spotlights hit the mansion's windows. Conway scrambled for his laptop, trying to trigger the advisor file to destroy Daniel. But when he opened the folder, it was empty. There was no evidence of Daniel's involvement. There was no record of Daniel ever having worked there. Daniel had used the mirror to erase himself. The front door was kicked in. As the agents swarmed the house, they found Conway screaming at a blank screen, a man trapped in a reality that no longer existed. 1,000 miles away, a man with a different face and a different name sat on a park bench. He pulled a small silver disc from his pocket, the master key to Project Mirror, and dropped it into a nearby storm drain. Daniel didn't have a cabin in Maine. He didn't have a flower shop or a best friend. He had something much more powerful, the ability to be no one. The ghost was finally gone, and he had taken the truth with him.
There is more stories to come. Please drop a comment, and if you like this content, please subscribe and give a thumbs up.